Hello, my name is Kenneth Dillon. I'm an historian and a former Department of State intelligence analyst, and I'm here today to talk with you about the anthrax mailings case of 2001. I don't want to give a comprehensive discussion of the case, that would be voluminous. I just want to give you my interpretation of the key aspects of the case. And I should note that I have the benefit of having worked closely with the person who's I consider the leading expert on the case, and that's attorney Ross Getman. However, this interpretation is my own interpretation. Letters were mailed on September 18th, 2001, 1 week after the Al-Qaeda attacks of 9/11. And they were mailed in Trenton, New Jersey. And over the next several weeks, various people became sick, and it became known that this was caused by anthrax. And that was something that was of great alarm to many Americans. It disrupted the postal system, and there were very expensive remediation effects that had to be carried out afterwards. And so it was a major event in 2001 of its type, second only to the 9/11 attacks. The US Postal Service and the FBI quickly began to investigate the attacks, which had killed 5 people. It had infected, the anthrax had infected 22, and five had died. The anthrax mailings were seen by many people at the beginning as just what they appeared to be from the letters, an Al-Qaeda second wave attack. But quite quickly, after the first 2 or 3 months, there began to be more and more talk about how it was probably a domestic mailer. And the investigation began to shift more and more to potential domestic mailer candidates who had used the 9/11 attacks as an excuse for carrying out their own nefarious designs. Over the next several years, the investigation went into pursuing these different leads and down a bunch of blind alleys, and nothing came of it except a lot of misleading discussion. Why was the public so ready to go in the direction of the domestic mailer? It wasn't so much the public, maybe we could say. We could say that many highly intelligent and well-informed people were misled themselves into thinking that it couldn't have been Al-Qaeda. Let's look at the reasons why, and we'll see that these were not very good reasons at all, and that in fact it was an Al-Qaeda attack. One of the things that was said when they determined that the anthrax in the letters had come from the flask of anthrax that was held at the United States Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases in Frederick, Maryland. They thought that the mailer must have been someone associated with that flask. So it would have to be domestic, of course, but we know that the security in the pre-9/11 era was extremely lax, and therefore eventually hundreds of people could have had access to that anthrax, scientists, American scientists, but also that gave an opportunity to Al-Qaeda to infiltrate and to pick up some anthrax for itself. And in fact, infiltration was a modus operandi of Al-Qaeda. So it was not a good argument at all that the original flask from which the anthrax came was held by the Fort Detrick, by U. Sambrid in Fort Detrick. So other arguments were made. One was that the letters had protective wording. They said, get penicillin now, or we have this anthrax. And so they warned their victims, and Al-Qaeda would never do that. But as a matter of fact, we know that warning the target of your attack beforehand was something that was enjoined by the Prophet Muhammad. So it was standard operating procedure. Another argument that was used was that if Al-Qaeda had had this weapon of mass destruction, it wouldn't have just put it in a couple of letters, it would have tried to spread it around in some way. Well, in fact, we know that the mailers, the attackers, the 9/11 attackers and their cohorts in the period before 9/11 were actively searching for ways to get the anthrax and distribute it from crop dusters in Florida and in Minnesota. There's plenty of evidence about that. Mohammed Atta, the leader of the Florida gang and of the 9/11 attacks, he was especially active going around and asking all the companies and people involved in the crop dusting industry how he could get into crop dusting. And also, one of the terrorists in the Florida group actually turned up at a doctor's office with a lesion on his leg that the doctor after 9/11 identified as an anthrax, cutaneous anthrax. At any rate, they were hunting for the way to get it into a crop duster, but it was impractical. It was too difficult to do. And so they fell back on mailing it in envelopes, letters. And a poison letter was a standard intelligence technique in the Middle East. So it was not surprising. Another thing that was said was if the anthrax had been from Al-Qaeda, they wouldn't have just stopped after 2 attacks. They would have kept attacking and attacking with it. But in fact, this anthrax, as we'll see, came from North America. It didn't come from Afghanistan, and they didn't have a capacity. They would have loved to have a capacity to multiply the anthrax, but they didn't have it. And so they had to go with what they had, a little bit of it, and so they used it in letters, and it was gone. And then another argument that was used was that they wouldn't have attacked these 2 Democratic senators with letters in the second wave, which was sent October 9th. They wouldn't have attacked them. They were not very interesting targets. But in fact, Senator Daschle was the Senate Majority Leader, and Senator Leahy had been sponsor of the rendition legislation whereby U.S. forces, when they captured an Al-Qaeda operative, would hand him over to the original country and the country of origin, and he would be tortured and then very probably executed. So Al-Qaeda hated Leahy, and the fact that he was one of the targets is confirmatory evidence that, in fact, it was Al-Qaeda. So there were a bunch of reasons why this was wrong, but nonetheless, many people thought it must be a domestic mailer, it can't be Al-Qaeda for this or that reason. And to this day, people think that way, and they're wrong. So let's examine what happened then. The besides the evidence that I've given, we'll see some more evidence that Al-Qaeda had the anthrax. But the best newish piece of evidence that Al-Qaeda was behind the attacks was that we now have a very excellent candidate for the title of the Anthrax Mailer, and that was Abderaouf Jdeh, Jdey. He was a Tunisian. He had got Canadian citizenship, had traveled to Afghanistan, trained at the same time as Mohammed Atta, and he had filmed a video, a martyrdom video, whereby he would be committing suicide against the enemy. So then he came back to Canada. He was studying biology at the University of Montreal. Then it appears that Atta came on the day before the 9/11 attacks, traveled to Portland, Maine. And the very obvious explanation of that is that that was the place where he could meet best with Abderaouf Jdeh coming from Montreal, and not just to meet and have a social occasion, but to hand over the vials of anthrax, which he didn't presumably want to put in the mail. Then, after the 9/11 attacks, in the next period, Abderaouf Jdeh apparently twice drove from Montreal to Trenton, New Jersey to mail the anthrax. And then he drove to New York City on November 12th, 2001. And he climbed aboard American Airlines Flight 587. And after it took off, he detonated a shoe bomb. And that caused the crash of the aircraft, total loss of 265 lives. We found out about that from a leaked intelligence interrogation of an Al-Qaeda detainee in Canada in the National Post of the Canadian media. And that identified shoe bomber as Abderaouf Jdeh. When I saw that, I thought about the situation, and I thought there are a bunch of reasons why we should think that he was actually also the mailer. And so I contacted FBI and explained those reasons to FBI. They seemed to have taken them very seriously, and they began to investigate, and they also did some things such as there began to be a very strict checking of shoes before transatlantic flights. And so they investigated very seriously, and there are a number of little items that suggest that they did find that he was indeed the anthrax mailer. I discussed those in my website, wastheanthraxpress.com. The article was Abderaouf Jdeh, the anthrax mailer. So that was around 2004. And into 2005, it looked very much as if they were going to come and announce to the public that they had solved the case, and then something happened. And they stopped pursuing it, and then they went off in a different direction. What happened? I think the best explanation that I know of is that the White House found out about it, and there President George Bush and Vice President Dick Cheney were eager to avoid a reinvestigation of the 9/11 attacks, and especially the whole question of what senior officials in the US government were doing in the run-up to the 9/11 attacks, which had been left out of that item had been left out of the the 9/11 Commission report. So we see that there's quite a bit of suppression of information and of evidence surrounding all of these events of 2001. And so Bush and Cheney put pressure on FBI Director Robert Mueller to just forget about today and keep investigating. And so he did. Mueller had been deeply involved in the investigation, intensely interested in the investigation up until about 2005. But from then on, he backed away and had almost nothing to do with it for the rest of the investigation. Before Jde had come to and here's a piece of the evidence, he should be thought of as a mailer, before he had come up to mailing the letters, before 9/11, even on August 16th, he had been detained by INS and the FBI, and they found in his possession biology textbooks. On the same day, Zacarias Moussaoui, an intending terrorist, had been also detained by INS and FBI, and in his possession was a computer disk containing information about crop dusting. And he had talked with the university about the possibility of taking a course in crop dusting. How had Al-Qaeda got a hold of the anthrax? I think the best explanation is that the US government had heard from many of the ex-Soviet microbiologists coming from the Soviet biowarfare program. And they had told us some pretty scary things about what the Soviets had done in terms of making their weapons more sophisticated and more difficult to deter. And so there was a project, very informal perhaps project, that was organized to prepare some anthrax that could serve as a kind of model of more sophisticated anthrax that could be used for vaccine testing, to prepare some vaccines that would be protective against the Soviet anthrax. The most likely place where this was run was at the Southern Research Institute facility across Frederick from USAMRIID, and its head was the former commander of USAMRIID, David France, and he seems to have recruited Bruce Ivins. Bruce Ivins, the custodian of the flask that contained the anthrax at USAMRIID, and the top expert on anthrax within USAMRIID. He recruited him to prepare this anthrax, and Ivins prepared a very crude version to serve, I take it, as the control in experiments, and a very highly refined, sophisticated version of it, the kind of anthrax that showed up in the letters to the senators. And Ivins later himself, in the course of the investigation, commented on how wonderful that anthrax was that they had found, how wonderfully refined and light it was. It just floated up in the air. So he was, it appears, boasting about his own efforts. How did it get to how did the anthrax get to Al-Qaeda? The best explanation, I think, is that France gave some of it to the former deputy at USAMRIID, who was Charles Bailey, who was leaving for the private sector to go to George Mason University in Manassas, Virginia. They had a Center for Biodefense. And his office there was close to the office of Ali Al-Tamimi, a biotech researcher and computer expert, and Al-Qaeda sympathizer. And Charles Bailey's anthrax somehow, Al-Tamimi found out about it and stole a share of it for himself, and then gave it to Mohammed Atta. That's the best explanation I can think of for how Al-Qaeda got the anthrax. The chief of the investigation, of the Amerithrax investigation, as it was called by FBI, up until 2006, was Richard Lambert, and he prepared in 2006 a 2,000-page interim major case summary of the anthrax investigation, in which there were 16 pages on Bruce Ivins as one of the suspects. In a later court filing after he had left FBI, Lambert wrote that FBI had a wealth of evidence that was potentially exculpatory about Bruce Ivins. And I asked for the 50 pages of the, actually 38 pages of the interim major case summary in a Freedom of Information Act request, and then I filed suit when it was not forthcoming. And in March of 2020, the court ruled that FBI could withhold from public scrutiny the 16 pages on Bruce Ivins. The investigation went on and focused more, after 2005, focused more and more on Bruce Ivins. He was very vulnerable, and he had, of course, he had the custodianship of the source flask of the anthrax that was mailed, except that the anthrax in the letters was a little bit different. Not too much, but a little bit different from the anthrax in the flask. So that opens a kind of question. At any rate, I think what had happened with Ivins was that in the run-up to the 9/11 attacks, there had been cable traffic coming in warning that Al-Qaeda was planning an attack against the US homeland. Ivins took that seriously, and as a patriotic American, took out his vials of anthrax and started working overtime in the evening in the hot suite at USAMRIID to test the various vaccines against these control, the crude type, and the sophisticated type of anthrax, the test anthrax, and he was working on there right through 9/11 and for another month or so, and of course the idea was to develop it so that to test and develop the vaccine so that they would have a vaccine for the U.S. Army, but potentially also for U.S. civilians as well. So he was doing his patriotic duty. But at a certain point, he realized after 9/11 that he had managed to make himself a prime suspect. So Ivins, knowing that he would be a very vulnerable suspect, he then began to cover up. And he did things like, for instance, he, without authorization, he twice cleaned up his office space to make sure there was no anthrax there, none of the attack anthrax. And so he acted in a way that was suspicious, and he did a number of other things like this that FBI would eventually point to. Now, in 2008, under a lot of investigative pressure, after the years of the investigation and much more focusing on Ivins at the end, all that investigative pressure, Ivins deteriorated, and he started to drink. He was taking drugs, and he was just in a very bad psychological state. And he finally, in 2008, committed suicide. At that point, FBI announced that it had been planning, at any rate, to prosecute him as the mailer of the anthrax letters. In 2010, FBI closed the case, and they published an Amerithrax summary document, and that was a document that put forth a lot of fairly weak circumstantial evidence. And on the critical question of tying Ivins to the scene of the crime, to Trenton, New Jersey, they had absolutely no evidence at all. So it was a kind of report or a case that in a law court, a defense attorney could take to pieces. They emphasized a lot his behavior in the last year, and found various kinds of things that he had done to be suspicious or somehow showing malign intent. In fact, we know from his earlier time at USAMRIID that Ivins, although he definitely had quirks and obsessions, there's no doubt about it, and they went so far as to include mailing false flag letters. Ivins was, however, in many other ways, it was quite normal. And he was actually, more than that, he was an active member of his community. He played the piano in church and at going away parties. He was a juggler. He taught kids how to juggle. He was a practical joker. He was full of fun, in addition to having some quirks and obsessions. So he wasn't perfect. And so they presented this picture of him, but they never addressed two very critical aspects of the whole question, the whole investigation. One was they never addressed the possibility that the mailer was different from the preparer of the anthrax. That's a pretty basic point. And so if you look at what they found as consciousness of guilt, they found a number of things that showed that he was guilty. Those can very easily be interpreted in a very different way, that they were Bruce Ivins as the innocent preparer, protecting himself against being falsely accused of being the anthrax mailer, because he knew that he had a lurid psychiatric history, and if he had ever admitted that he had been the preparer of the anthrax, FBI would never believe that he hadn't mailed it. So that's one weakness of that Amerithrax summary report. Another one is that they dismiss Al-Qaeda in a couple of lines, and that's completely unacceptable. Now, let's take a look at some conclusions. First, we can say the 9/11 attacks were only one of three attacks by Al-Qaeda in 2001. There was the 9/11 attacks, then there was the anthrax mailings, and then there was the shoe bombing of Flight 587. Second, there's been a great deal of suppression of information and evidence, and not just by FBI, but by the US media. Although the media did a good job the first year or so in talking about the Al-Qaeda side of the case, then they dropped away on that pretty much, and they did suppress quite a few other things. And it's quite clear now that the US media, the editors of America, will not touch the subject of the events of 2001 with a 10-foot pole. There's been no serious discussion in the US media for years about those events. And a third point is that, yes, another part of that is that many individuals and organizations that have information relevant to this investigation appear not to have come forward and told what they knew to FBI. A third point is many highly intelligent and well-informed people simply got it wrong on going for the domestic mailer theory over the Al-Qaeda theory. So we need to talk about that for the future, how we can avoid that kind of thing happening. A fourth point, and that is that much more likely than not, Abd al-Day was the anthrax mailer and the shoe bomber Flight 587. And lastly, this was a shocking and outrageous case. We need to get to the bottom of it.